Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't squeeze in Shah Rukh Khan into the title. Probably more ladies would have been present in the audience if I had done, probably. Just one point of clarification. I'm no longer on research leave, which is one of the reasons why this lecture is taking place after Easter, because we finish our teaching and so on. And so it's only at just this time of the year that we get kind of space free for doing overseas trips and so on. But of course, you're right to mention that I've been involved in the RELI-GARE project, and it is a 3-year project, which is now coming to its end. Actually, we've just received a short extension up to this month, while we prepare our final report and so on. And that project is concerned primarily with religious diversity and the response of various European legal systems to the increasing religious diversity across different European countries. So it's very, in fact, today's presentation is very much related to some of the theoretical work I've been doing as part of that project, and relating it to different developments which have been occurring in different parts of Europe. And for this for the purpose of the project, actually, Europe includes Turkey. I know sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but we also take in part of the other side of the Bosphorus for the project. So today's lecture, as you can see, I mean, the title is a bit of a mouthful, and originally I wanted to be even more ambitious and include India and Japan, and Mitra said, well, you can have India, but you can't have Japan. And then
That's right.
in fact, just a few days ago, I came back to her and said, well, can I drop India as well? Because I kind of remembered that you only want me to speak for half an hour, and how can I, like, do you want me to speak 15 minutes on Britain and 15 minutes for India? It's just an impossible job, as some of the India experts here will be able to confirm. So I've stuck to England, but I think we'll still have enough to talk about. The talk is a little bit theory heavy, so I kind of apologize and don't make any apologies for that, because it's a kind of I think that's one of the areas where we haven't been so successful. We've been very descriptive in our research so far in relation to religious diversity, but we haven't really tried to make a theoretical explanation for why certain things are happening and why people say certain things in certain way, think certain things in certain way, and so on. So I think this is also an attempt to share with you some thoughts and kind of just air them in a way, and to get your feedback on what you think about what I'm thinking, and that kind of partly explains the gobbledygook title as well. So first thing is, well, just the kind of batting order, if you like. First of all, I want to say something about the concept of the secular and the process which secularization is, right? Then going on from that, I also want to discuss a concept that I've been playing with recently, which has been developed by S.N. Balagangadhara in the University of Ghent in Belgium, and which he calls colonial consciousness, and he relates it to Edward Said's work in a very interesting way. Edward Said's work on Orientalism, of course, and for both the secular and secularization and for colonial consciousness, I also want to introduce to you 2 separate case studies which speak to those concepts and kind of concretize what they might mean in empirical reality. So hopefully they'll make more sense once you look at the case studies. And the overall question is, of course, how Muslim law changes in the English context. So theoretically, how can we relate changes within Muslim law to these above mentioned concepts? So that's the hopefully the manner of proceeding. Now, I want to start off with a quote also by S.N. Balagangadhara in his book published in 1994, which is called "The Heathen in His Blindness: Asia, the West, and the Dynamic of Religion." And I found that book over the last few years that I've been reading it. I've been reading it several times, actually, at least 3 times. Found it extremely interesting and very instructive in trying to think about what European legal systems might be doing in relation to religious diversity. And I've just picked out a couple of passages over 2 or so pages where he offers these insights, right, about what the secular really means within a Christian religious context and its place within a Christian religious context. So I'll just be quiet for a couple of seconds while you read that. Of course, it's often said that the idea of the secular is a creature of Christian theology. I mean, that's fairly uncontested, and many people assert that and agree with that. But the way in which Balagangadhar is framing the role of the secular here is particularly what I find interesting. And that is this kind of processual role where the secular is the zone which is allocated to those aspects of the idolatrous world which have been cleansed or purged of their idolatry, right? So it's only after undergoing that kind of purgatory process that you find that there is an approved space for the secular. Of course, Christians among themselves don't agree about the precise contours of the secular, right? So it's always up for contestation, right? So my argument isn't that it's a concrete thing out there that we can identify, but it's a kind of it's a space, conceptual space, which is allocated to certain phenomena in the world once they're being cleansed of idolatry. And of course, there is a contest about that. Now, the second quote is also interesting because that provides a clue to what I'm going to be referring and what Balagangadhar refers in his later writing to the process of secularization. Which is the spreading into the common sense of Western society, certain ideas which at their core are Christian theological concepts. Right? This is what secularism. But they are spread by various processes of popularization in a non-religious guise. So that's why I think what he says about the de-Christianized religious world is quite important, just to bear in mind as a reference. I mean, all this presupposes that within Western culture and within Christianity specifically, there is a particular dynamic, right? And there is a process which other cultures have to undergo in their encounter with the Christian world or the Western world, where the pagan aspects of any culture have to be cleansed of their idolatry, right? Now, getting more legal, it seems it's very interesting to note that customs, right, which are of course a core feature of legal systems, are also suspected of being the repositories or the bearers of idolatrous practices, right, or heathen practices. And so within the Christian world, you often find this that there is a kind of spotlight cast upon customs practiced by various communities around the world, including within Christendom, right? Where custom is always suspected, and culture more widely is always suspected of being the bearer of idolatrous practices, and therefore it is kind of becomes liable to be scoped out and assessed for the extent to which there is an idolatry which contained within it. Now, you can see the third bullet point is relates to the point that this kind of scoping out is done both within Christianity and vis-a-vis other cultures, right? And particularly other cultures which are considered to be rival religions. Now, from a Christian perspective, of course, other rival religions are false religions, right? And so, again, there is this kind of initial suspicion that they are full of idolatrous practices which need to be cleansed. And Islam is one of those religions. Now, it sounds maybe odd that I'm classifying Islam as a religion with an idolatrous religion, because of course Muslims would deny that very strongly, right? But from a Christian perspective, you can see this actually working out in the encounter of the Christian world with the Islamic world, right? And if you look at the very early sources around the time of the First Crusade, you find that in fact Christians are very much thinking of Muslims as people who practice idolatry, right? And over a period of time, of course, Western knowledge about Islam has changed, and it's learned more about Islam and so on, and it's been perhaps allocated more a space where it is said to be a kind of proper religion alongside Judaism, right? But there is always this suspicion that there is, a kind of now secularized suspicion that Islam is also the bearer of idolatrous practices, and so hence the. Hence, I'm already at the last bullet point. I'm sorry. Yeah. So over a period of time, this whole dynamic of religion has been secularized, right? So today we don't talk about idolatrous practices amongst Muslims, but even in secular liberal discourse, actually, we don't even talk about it with respect to Hindus or practitioners of Shinto and Confucians and all kinds of other people. We've kind of sanitized the language, but inherent within the social sciences are still the kind of secularized versions of these assumptions, right, which carry them through, which are carried through in research programs and so on. And the argument here is that these are basically secularized forms of Christian theological ideas, right, with the tag of religion or Christianity specifically removed from them. Now, just moving on to Islam, right? Because I already referenced Islam and said that, well, Muslims, of course, don't like to think of it as an idolatrous religion. And it's true, right? In fact, Islam shares some of these aspects of Christianity, because within Islam also there is a program of getting rid of idolatrous practices, right? From its inception. That's one of the self kind of concepts or bases of Islam. Often, however, the question is, at least to my mind, is posed, well, what is the thing within Islam which is performing the role which secular performs within the Christian world, right? Now, if you talk to Muslims, many Muslims, particularly Islamists, will say, we reject the idea of the secular, right? Because the secular is really, for us, a sign of the kind of degraded character of Western civilization, right? Because basically it's a sign that you've got rid of God and basically secularized God, right? In the modern state and so on. So we reject the idea of the secular, right? Which is performing the role which secular performs within the Christian world, right? Now, if you talk to Muslims, many Muslims, particularly Islamists, will say, we reject the idea of the secular, right? Because the secular is really, for us, a sign of the kind of degraded character of Western civilization, right? Because basically it's a sign that you've got rid of God and basically secularized God, right? In the modern state and so on. So we reject the idea of the secular, right? And one is really at pains to find, will be at pains to find a kind of conceptual equivalent which performs the role of the secular within Islam. It's very interesting to read Talal Asad's work on this, right? Because he says that conceptual equivalents for the secular were developed within the Muslim world, but only after contact with the Western world and during the colonial period, right? So he references Arabic dictionaries where he shows the development of new neologisms, basically, right? Which took the place of the secular within the Arabic language, but that's something that only occurs after Western contact, right? So there is still a question about, well, all right, if Islam is similar, where is the secular? Or is it right to say that basically Islam does without this concept, right? There is no functional equivalent of the secular within Islam, although it has anti-idolatrous tendencies, right, within it. So, and it is also true, I mean, particularly when we look at the contact between the Muslim world and the Western world, we find that not only are there neologisms and so on created, right, and kind of new terms within Arabic dictionaries invented, but you see certain processes, legal processes, which occur, right? And if you look at Talal Asad's work, the same work actually, he also talks about developments within the Egyptian legal system, right, where there are certain legislative moves to Islamize that legal system and to cleanse it of idolatrous elements. Similarly, in India, right, when you look at the family law legislation or the Islamic law legislation of 1937, right, and later on 1939 and so on, you find that there are also similar moves under the auspices of the British colonial state, where there is also an attempt to purge Islam of its idolatrous elements, right? And particularly there is a limitation of the role of custom, right? And a kind of theologizing of Islam at the same time, or Islamic law. So you see very interesting processes, and these processes in the earlier period of kind of colonial contact with the Muslim world, that shows that certain processes are set in train when there is a contact between the Muslim and the Western worlds, right? And one of my core arguments is that you find that today in the diasporic sphere, right, the Muslim diasporic sphere, similar kinds of things are taking place, right? So there is a kind of purging of idolatrous elements particularly when, right? At least the process is exacerbated when there is Western contact with the Muslim world or with Muslims, right? And I'm calling this process a process of Shariatization, right? The term is not original to me, but I think the way I'm applying it is perhaps more specific. A broader concept could be simply, many people have used the concept of Islamization. Right? You could even use that concept, but I thought Shariatization Secularization is more appropriately legal, right? So it kind of does the work. Right. Now, an illustration of this process in the contemporary diasporic sphere within the British Muslim context, right, and particularly British Muslim South Asian context. And so my case study here is a very interesting case. It's a reported case, right? We don't find it in the official law reports, but you will find it on the internet, right, as a reported case, right? At least you can read the judgment. And it's a case of two British Bangladeshis who get married, right? But they only do now something which is a very typical phenomenon now is that they have a nikah-only marriage, right? They don't register the marriages so that it has official sanction, right? They do a nikah-only marriage, which is a Muslim-only marriage, and this is a kind of spreading tendency amongst British Muslims, right? It's very widespread, and quite a contrast to what Hindus and Sikhs are doing in parallel, right? Who tend to more often register their marriages. In fact, almost always tend to register marriages, whereas Muslims actually nowadays the evidence is that they're very rarely registering their marriages so that they have validity within English law. So a bit of difference there. Anyway, that's kind of just the furniture. Now, the case involves certain gifts which were given during the marriage, right? So you can imagine typical South Asian arrangement, lots of gifts kind of are transacted and, in different directions. Now, the marriage breaks down fairly fast, right? For some reason, it's not entirely clear. If you look at all the documentations, it's not clear what actually happened within the couple or between the parties. But maybe they don't like each other, or they were forced into this marriage. It's not 100% clear. Anyway, it's clear they don't want to be together, right? Then the issue of the return of the gifts is taken up by the respective kind of the elders within on either side, and the marriage itself is dissolved by a Sharia council, right, in East London. Hardly an untypical thing to occur, right? For a marriage which hasn't been registered officially, the main port of call is really the Sharia councils. They are the ones who do the business of dissolving such marriages. And as I said, this is an increasingly perceptible phenomenon certainly in the British Muslim diaspora. Now, the Sharia council dissolves the nikah, right, but doesn't address the question of what happens to the gifts, right? To whom do they belong, right? And should any of them be returned, and so on. The allegation is that the bride and her mother have walked away with something like £25,000 worth of jewelry, right? Which was apparently not part of the dower, right? The Islamic mahr, right? So what is it if it's not part of that, right? It's clearly some other part of the kind of conventional or customary arrangements, which are gift-giving arrangements, which are taking place. Now, the boy's father takes the case to the county court, right? Not having had any result from the Sharia council on the matter of the return of the gifts. Now, the county court, very interestingly, instructs an expert in Islamic law, right? Quote unquote expert. Now, this expert is also the chap. His name is Faiz Siddiqui, Sheikh Siddiqui as is known. Now, he's inherited the Gadi, the kind of Sufi Gadi of his father, who used to be a Sufi Sheikh, right? And so he and his brothers are engaged in that kind of like tasawwuf type of activity. But in parallel, they've also set up the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, right? Of which there are several branches in the United Kingdom. So here is a body which is ostensibly trying to occupy a space between official English law and unofficial Islamic law in the British legal sphere, so as to offer types of arbitration which would have validity in English law as well. We can talk about that more later on in the discussion if there's time. For present purposes, Sheikh Siddiqui's role is to be an expert in these particular court proceedings. Now, not untypically maybe for an alim or the ulama in general, he Islamizes the whole, or Shariatizes, right, what actually happened between the parties here when the gifts were exchanged, right? He says, well, actually you've got to look at this as a contractual arrangement, because as Muslims that's how we would look at it, right? We wouldn't look at it as a customary arrangement, but simply a contractual, because this is Islamic. And in Islam, you said that you're going to, according to an Islamic law interpretation, you said in your marriage contract that you'll give £15,000 worth of money to the bride upon marriage. They have some gifts that you gave them which are non-returnable, right? So you still owe the dower money. You still haven't paid it, right? Obviously, this is not what the father of the boy wants to hear, right? Now, the county court actually accepts this version, right? In its own way, it accepts the contractualization of an Islamic nikah, which of course in Islamic theological terms it is a contract, right? But it's also given authenticity or authority of English law, right? Say, well, kind of secularized, right? Contract also applies to this arrangement. So the father doesn't get the gifts back, right? The jewelry. So he tries to challenge, right, to reopen the case before the Court of Appeal by applying for permission to appeal. Now, our main source of information is actually what the Court of Appeal is saying. So you have to read to a certain extent between the lines, but it's kind of fairly clear. And of course, I've talked to Faiz Siddiqui about this case and so on. So has John Bowen. If you read one of his recent articles, he gives a fairly good account of not only the case, but also Shaykh Siddiqui's version of events and his take on it. At the Court of Appeal level, they basically say, well, we can't do anything about this, right? The county court judgment stands, there you are, right? Now, what I take away from this case is that at least some of the parties involved here, right, were trying to advocate or go for a kind of Shariatized interpretation of what happened, right? They want to get away from the customary sphere, right? Here, where you have a very short-lived marriage, an exchange of gifts and so on, and at least one could have argued, right, within the customary sphere that, well, if there's no marriage, then you should have returned the gifts, right? But if you contractualize it, right, on the one hand, and say on the other hand that these are gifts according to English law or even Islamic law, right, they're non-returnable, right? So custom is kind of expunged, right? And you can see Shaykh Siddiqui's statement here, right, which actually is a quote from John Bowen's article. He says, nikah is a contract, it shouldn't be entered into, right, according to Pakistani or Indian ideas. Read customs or culture here, right, or idolatrous practices. So what's the kind of big picture here? Is the contact with Western law, right, actually helping to Shariatize matters of Muslim law in the diasporic Muslim context? And I think this case kind of says, at least the interpretation that I've given to it kind of helps us to see that there may be something concrete about this process, right, which is involves the expunging of customs, and because they are kind of they signify the ongoing practices of idolatry among Muslims. Okay, on to Orientalism and colonial consciousness, right? Now here I'm drawing on Balagangadhara's more recent book, right, Reconceptualizing India Studies. Very interesting book. I really recommend that you read it. A lot of it is kind of previously published stuff, which is, kind of in various different places. So he's bringing it all together and giving a kind of more coherent analysis of his previous work here. Right? He has a very interesting take on Orientalism, which he sees, right, and actually through a very, very careful reading of Edward Said's work, right, he actually is able to show that even in Edward Said you can see that the Orientalism becomes part of an imaginary within the Western mind, right? It doesn't reflect reality, right? And because it doesn't reflect, because it's part of the Western imagination, which the West has constructed through its own lenses, if you like, yeah, which are powerfully informed by certain of the presuppositions of Western culture, including Christianity, it's not amenable to being shifted through the adducing of empirical evidence, right? So if you say, well, this doesn't exist, this particular fact doesn't exist within our cultural framework or something, it doesn't disturb Orientalism, right? It might adjust it, right, to a certain extent, but the essential framework through which Orientalism functions remains intact, right? Precisely because it's an imaginary, and that's because that's why it's not amenable to correction through the adducing of empirical evidence. Yeah. So, okay, now moving on from Orientalism, right, is colonialism. Now, colonialism has a very, very important role to play in a cognitive sense, right? Because not only does colonialism produce, right, or at least perpetuate an account of Orientalism or an Orientalist account, right? Now, the argument here is that colonialism doesn't invent Orientalism. This is we have to be kind of careful about this. It doesn't matter so much for today's purposes, but the general argument, at least on the part of Balagangadhara, is that colonialism simply takes the project of Orientalism to a new level, right? So the question is, to what level does it take it? Now, colonialism helps to enforce the account which has been produced by the colonizer, right, into the mind of the colonized, right? So the colonized, because of the violence of colonialism, right? This is where the link between Orientalism and colonialism comes in. Orientalism is, the Orientalist account becomes part of the account which is accepted by the colonized, right? So the violence that attends colonialism is quite significant here. Now, we also see, then this is the last bullet point here, is that Western intervention doesn't take place on in every aspect of society, right? The West itself, right? Both within the colonial sphere and if you look at the contemporary diasporic spheres, you find that Western legal systems, or Western legality kind of proceeds through trying to address certain features of the society of the colonized, right? Or the society of the diasporic communities that today live as non-dominant communities in the West. And we can find clues within Christian anthropology and Christian theology as to why particular aspects of life are picked out for reform, right? And why they offend Western reason. And my illustration comes from the phenomenon of legally wanting to tackle forced marriage, right? In the British context. Now, Britain, among the European countries we studied, is the only one so far to have specific legislation on forced marriage, right? We have some legislation from 2007, which I'll talk about. But as a preface to that, right, it's important to bear in mind that marriage within Christianity is fundamentally structured through the idea of consent, right? If you look at the very earliest writings of the canonists and so on, actually Harold Berman's work here is very instructive, right? Because he actually, you know it quite well. He shows very clearly, right, that when it came to thinking about the application of Christian theology and canon law, in the field of marriage, consent was elevated as one of the key principles. And of course it presumes certain things about the human being, the kind of person which the canon law presumes and so on, right, as autonomous and goal-directed and so on, and capable of giving consent to marriage. Now, it's also interesting that consent is elevated as a key aspect of Christian marriage, while at the same time minimizing the role of kinship, right? The role of kinship. Now, if you look at European societies also, the kinship played a very important part in marriage making, right? But the canonists come along and say, hang on, right? It's a question of individual will, right? And thereby wanting to limit the role of kinship, right? Now, in 21st century Britain, you get a very similar kind of discourse happening, right? Very interesting, but in a secularized form, obviously. I mean, the third bullet point is really about the fact that the idea of consent itself has been secularized through contemporary marriage legislation. And you see that all over the Western world, actually, even in the non-Western world with transplanted laws from the West and so on, you find the idea of consent to marriage is one of the key aspects of marriage making. Now, going on from that to looking at contemporary practices of marriage making among South Asian Muslims, I don't think it's really sustainable to say that they are fundamentally motivated by the idea of consent, right? That's not what makes them tick, right? It's about family arrangements, right? And what families think is the right thing to do for the future of the sustenance of not only the couple, but the progress of their society and so on. So they have quite different, right, ingredients which go into decisions to make marriages, right? And earlier in the class I also mentioned that so many Muslim marriages, South Asian Muslim marriages in Britain are today cousin marriages, increasingly so, in fact, if you compare the situation with Pakistan and so on. So these are increasingly and more so, familial arrangements, right, which involve all kinds of networks of complicated kind of kinship arrangements in amongst them. So consent, not that relevant, right? Does he or she like the spouse and, you know, it really has a romantic inclinations towards him? Not that relevant, right? He or she is going to marry, that's it, right? And the decision is actually left to somebody else who is presumed to know better. So consent kind of takes an exit, right? Or was in fact never really present. Now, in comes the Forced Marriage Act of 2007, right? As I said, this is the only legislation which is seemingly, I don't know about the North American situation, but certainly in the European context, exists to provide particular remedies for people who feel themselves trapped in forced marriages or about to go into a forced marriage. Right? This legislation allows the making of court orders, right, to prevent persons being coerced into marriages. At the moment, it provides for civil remedies, right, in the form of these court orders, but it is on the cards, right? We do have suggestions from ministers in the government that they want to criminalize the practice of forced marriages, right? So anybody suspected of being party to, right, the arrangement of a forced marriage, if I can put it like that, is potentially likely to be or liable to be criminalized. Already, however, you see that in the enforcement process of the civil remedies that the 2007 Act provides, you find the increasing involvement of police. Right? So in a way, in a de facto sense, it's already being criminalized because social workers don't really want to go into these families and ask nosy questions about, do you consent to this marriage and so on. So what social workers tend to do is phone the police, and it's the police who kind of go into the homes of these people and possibly arrest them and so on. And criminalization maybe occurs if it occurs not under legislation which is specific to forced marriages, but on other grounds, right? Maybe resisting arrest or, whatever, ordinary criminal sanctions for crimes of violence and so on. But nevertheless, criminalization is now on the card. So you find that there is a kind of ratcheting up of state interest, right, in controlling this phenomenon, which of course makes sense within a Western framework, right? I'm not saying it doesn't make sense, right, to Westerners to think about marriage fundamentally in terms of consent, right? The long history is there, right? Something like 1,000 years of history is behind this this idea of marriage within the West, right? But I'm also saying that forced marriage is an experiential entity which is falsely assumed to exist in the world. To that extent, it is like Orientalism, right? In the sense that it is imaginary because it makes sense to Western people, right? There is an assumption that it makes sense to everybody, right? And particularly, it seems as if the marriage of others are fundamentally not based on consent, although they should be, and therefore they should come under legal control and potentially criminal sanction, right? So that's why, hence the parallel with Orientalism. Now, the colonial parallel comes in because there's also violence here. Right? Particularly if you're looking at police interventions already under the civil legislation, but eventually with criminalization, there's definite state violence which is going to be exercised on these people, right? With specific grounds for criminalizing people who engage in forced marriages. You see this aspect of violence coming in as well, right? Against non-dominant communities under Western control. Right? So on both grounds, on the Orientalism grounds and in terms of colonial consciousness, well, at least the imposition of force, right, with which there is a parallel to colonialism, there is, the circumstances have been created for colonial consciousness to potentially arise. Now, how does that arise? Now, this quote isn't directly on point there, right? This quote basically shows us how consent is the idea of consent and the non-use of force in marriage is kind of assumed to be a universal framework which governs all kind of marriages, right? This is from a government minister in the preface to a study which the Ministry of Justice did to evaluate how the forced marriage legislation was working, right? So this is it's online, you can access this quite easily, right? So now consent becomes a freely given consent becomes a requisite not only of Christian but also Jewish, Hindu, Muslim and Sikh marriages, right? And of course, invocation of human rights kind of consolidates the universalizing kind of aspect of this. So, and of rights rhetoric and so on. So, okay, I won't detain you too much with that, but this is the more interesting one, I think. Right. Enter the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal with its report on forced marriages, right? Remember Shai Siddiqui, who I mentioned earlier, who happened to be also an expert witness in the case that we looked at. Look at what he's saying. It's typical within British Muslim discourse to look at to describe the Indian subcontinent as Asian subcontinent, by the way. because India has all kinds of idolatrous connotations, right? So it already starts in the first line. Right, what's going on here? How do we explain this? How I like to look at it is that, of course, if you press hard, you can find evidence within Islamic legal thinking, right? To show exactly that marriage comes about because of the consent of two parties, right? Freely given. That's how Islamic law itself is structured, right? But that's not what most Muslims are doing today in Britain or elsewhere in the world, right? They are not applying Islamic law necessarily when they get married. They're actually doing something which is more customary. In fact, Shaikh Siddiqui mentioned, the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal report acknowledges that, right? They are marrying according to their traditional frameworks, right? Which means ancestral practices, right? Not enacting of Islamic law. Right? Of course, they do nikahs and so on, but how much meaning is given to that, right? According to an Islamic legal framework is anybody's guess, right? More often than not, they're enacting customary practices, right? That's what they're doing when they're getting married. But if you go according to this account, right, certainly Muslims should, or ought to, be having more attention, paying more attention to the Islamic legal thinking on these matters. Again, Shariatization, right? But what's happening here, right? Now, the dominant account, as illustrated in the previous quote by the British minister, is absorbed into Muslim thinking, contemporary British diasporic Muslim thinking, right? But an Islamic framework is given to that, right? So there is colonial consciousness, I would argue, but it's hidden because of the framing of that colonial consciousness in an Islamic context, in a Shariatized context, right? So the idea that forced marriage is something which is intelligible to Muslims is accepted, right? Even though actually to those people who are practicing something which passes for forced marriage, it's not. Right? So it is accepted, and it's given an Islamic legal justification. Right? So I think this shows to me that not only is there something going on which is akin to colonialism through the exercise of violence, but there is a kind of reality in the British Muslim diaspora today to or the reality of British Muslim diaspora, I think, gives grounds for thinking that there is something which is also akin to colonial consciousness, right? Where the dominated party actually accepts the account which the dominant community or group or whatever is producing. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, can I just, before we go into questions, in my eagerness not to forget that the Center for European Studies was sponsoring this talk, I forgot to mention all about the Global Legal Studies Center and the South Asia Legal Studies Working Group. So before they start firing their questions at the speaker, they co-sponsored it, so they have a certain right to ask questions. But all right, Don, go ahead.
All right, I've got a million questions. I'll save some for later today, but so I want to pose a couple of challenges to, especially the use of Balak and Gadara, who I find as a thinker tends to work in really big macro categories, and most of the way that your talk also did the same in a certain way. The West, right, and Asia as a kind of idea. And I wonder, as a guy who works on legal pluralism, who clearly is working in these, with really concrete accounts and so forth, where the influences on somebody like Sheikh Siddiqui or this arbitration council aren't being necessarily couched in these macro terms. Whether Balak and Gadara do us a disservice by putting things in such huge terms. And so and what I mean by that is that when Bala Gangadhara asserts the Christian this or that, that's a certain kind of Orientalization of the West in a certain. It puts everybody in one category. It makes it monolithic. Occidentalism. Thank you. Yeah. And so that's one challenge. Is how do you reconcile what's clearly a drive in your own work to recognize a pluralism of things, but also to grapple with that theoretically with a set of categories that are almost anti-pluralistic by their nature. They tend to unify things under macro categories. So that's one kind of question. The second, it really has to do with I'll leave it at that for now because I have to formulate the other question for now. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to take more questions or?
No, why don't you?
Okay.
You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. I think this kind of observation has often been made about not just about Balu's work, but other people who work in these kind of macro categories. I think at a certain level of generalization, it's admissible to use large categories, right? And I mean, Balu is obviously, he's not somebody who would deny that there is like variety and complexity in every social context and so on. Quite obviously there is. I mean, for instance, when you write about Hindu law, should I say to you that, when you use the title Hindu law for your book, you should say, you should have titled it The Complexity Within Hindu Law or something like you wouldn't.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think all of us are abstracting to a certain level, right, within academic framework, but that with the acknowledgement that the kind of social reality that we're describing is complex, but we're also, you're right, we are making an assertion that at a certain level of abstraction, it is possible to generalize, right? And that's what scientific theorization is about. It is about generalizing, and then always, of course, when you're faced with instances which don't fit within your general theory, you should be able to account for them.
So the thing that I'm becoming even increasingly self-critical of is precisely this idea that we're not doing enough justification of our invocation of macro categories. What justifies in this context the use of these macro categories? I agree with you that it could, there are occasions where, for the sake of just, orienting people in broad ways, that kind of thing, abstractions are necessary, right? But where in Balu's work are the justifications for this? It's assumed that we can trade in these categories without any distortion or a kind of problem, and that's where I'm a little nervous. I remembered my other question, which is about there's a nice article that Shelley Pollack wrote a long time ago called Deep Orientalism, which I'll send you. But there's this question is about the role of custom within Islamic law as a matter of fiqh or Shariat studies or something like that, where urf, right, if I understand it correctly, and Asif will correct me, is already viewed with some distrust.
Yeah.
Right. And in Pollack's terms, it's already pre-orientalized at a certain level when another community comes and encounters that tradition, and so you already have a kind of ready-made system that's already distrustful of custom from within its own tradition, and they just exacerbate that by saying, "Oh, see, so what we need to do is." So I'm curious about the idea that it's Shariatization instead of something like that the issue is textualization or codification or other things that I know you were suspicious of as well, with good reason, meaning that the law is black letter only, right?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does, and I like your question because it's something that I was thinking about as well. That there is actually a double layer of Orientalism here, right? If you look at some accounts of Ottoman history, right? It's kind of not related, but it's not unrelated completely either. Ottoman history, there are good grounds for saying that the Ottomans themselves were engaged in a kind of Orientalism of their own, right? Of surrounding communities, particularly towards the east, like the Kurds and the Arabs and so on. Maqdisi has written quite nicely about this. So that is the Islamic theological framework itself, you can argue, actually provides the basis for a certain type of colonial consciousness in itself. So what you're seeing is a kind of layering of different colonial consciousnesses. And I think that would be a very productive thing to dig into in future. It's not something I had thought about putting it in somewhere, but I thought I won't have enough time for it, and it also needs work. But the argument here is slightly more modest in the sense that yes, Islam has these tendencies or has the framework to be mobilized if necessary, and that mobilization of this framework occurs more rapidly when there is Western contact. So it's more of a modest argument there. In relation to your earlier question, it is. You're saying what allows us to make these generalizations? Observation will allow us. So unless you're also arguing that the phenomenon identified as Orientalism by Edward Said is not defensible, right? Because he's very consciously puts Orientalism or describes Orientalism as something which is there because, or identifiable because there has been a pattern which can be detected in Western accounts of the Orient. Right? There is a pattern there. And there are patterns within Western legal systems which at a certain level you can generalize about. I mean, I'm writing somewhere else about this as well, but it is possible, I think, but it requires us to first of all want to do that and not be bewildered by variety. Right? So we should kind of take a few bits of data and see if it is possible to make generalizations. If it's there, then we can propose it, at least as a hypothesis, if not a theoretical.
Yeah, can I open the, I just want to encourage the grad students to ask some questions because they may not have a chance later. Is that okay? Yeah, go for it, John.
I guess in kind of drawing off of the conversation that's already been going on, I have a concern about the idea of colonial consciousness as something that's imposed. It worries me for the problem of agency there. I mean, I would like to suggest that the same sort of trend of I would call it overcompensation on the part of people who are it happens when you see Buddhists and Hindus, particularly in colonial South Asia, trying to argue against Christianity or against the West, saying we were already scientific, like Buddhism was already a scientific religion, Islam was already a scientific religion, Hinduism was already a scientific religion before the colonizer came. And it also happens in the context of secularism or Christianity, that all those good things that the Christians say they have that we don't have, we had them already, and we had them to a greater extent. So there's an agency that's going on there in which the arguments of the colonizers are actively taken up in an act of trying to combat the missionary or combat the Western scientist. And I would say here it's also happening in the case of law, that it's, custom is being made the scapegoat, obviously. It's losing out. But it's in an active process of trying to say, we have all those good things that Western law has. And if it doesn't seem that way, it's just because we've been corrupted by these customary practices. So don't make that mistake. Don't level those criticisms against us. So in saying that colonial consciousness is something imposed, we kind of miss out on that fact that there's an active argumentation. It might be the easiest way of making those arguments, and it's not necessarily the most satisfactory way of making those arguments. Counter-arguments could have been made celebrating custom and not making it a scapegoat. But I'm just worried that whole aspect is going to be missed if we take kind of a hard stance that this is being imposed. The colonizer are completely passive here, and they have no choice in the matter but to have this actively, forced upon them.
Yeah. So you want me to cite somebody asserting the validity of custom? That's what you expect from me.
It's a possibility. I don't know if whether it's ever taken up.
Well, in my discussions with British Muslims, they never do that, right? This is the thing that I find remarkable, right? So this is where the pattern comes in, right? That British Muslims are unable to make a case for the, if you like, self-authorization of custom, for customs to be able to stand on their own ground, right? They're always, there is a kind of cognitive step which is made through which it has to be justified through Shariatization, basically. I had a very interesting conversation with an academic friend of mine who is also a Muslim, Tawida Ahmed. She won't mind my mentioning it because we had kind of an open discussion about it in the presence of other people. She's a legal academic. She teaches at the University of Reading, and I posed this problem of forced marriage to her as well. And so I said, well, it's not intelligible outside of a Western theological framework. And she seemed to agree for a few moments. Then she said, but in Islam also, we have this idea of consent, right? But in the first instance, there's a silence. And then there is a justification which relies on an Islamic framework, right? And I find this happening repeatedly, right, among British Muslims. And it's remarkable. That's why I think it's worth noticing, right? That the ultimate sacrifice is actually borne by the poor old custom, or which is the ancestral tradition, which is whatever in the South Asian context, it's suspected of being Hindu or whatever it is, Buddhist or something.
Asfa, were you waiting?
Oh, that's okay.
Go Sana and then go ahead.
Thank you. I don't think that agency has to be located in someone making an argument about custom. I think what John was trying to sort of urge you to analyze, even in this discourse that is being sort of accepted as the starting point for these claims, is that there is an active sort of critique going on of this category of forced marriages that perhaps does not, isn't translatable. But ultimately it comes down to how claims are being made in the legal sphere, right? And you can't sort of make a claim on custom if in fact the law is not recognizing it. And as far as the law is concerned, it is about religion, not about custom at all. And this in a way sort of gets to, in fact, the difference between colonial consciousness. And I do sort of take your argument about the continuity in terms of how we are analyzing this. But this is a multicultural state, and multicultural Britain defines itself not as culture but multiracial, really. Culture and religion. Sorry, not as sort of culture but as religion. So culture and religion, in fact, get conflated for immigrant diasporic communities as far as the British state is concerned, and that's the reason why there is this sort of return to the textual tradition of Islam, because trying to make an argument about custom, there is that is agency, but that's not going to fly in the sort of appeals court at all. So perhaps there is a way of thinking about this use of what you're calling sort of colonial discourse. I would sort of call it multicultural discourse that does locate agency. And isn't really about just receiving, accepting it completely, but the agency isn't always located in sort of trying to make the counter argument. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but if you're saying that, then what's the point of agency? Like, what's the point of constantly? Postmodernists are very good at doing this, right? You guys constantly talk about agency as if it was something, it's going to lead you to some kind of salvation. But if you can't even articulate your own experience of a particular phenomenon, and you're using the colonizer's account of it, then what's the point of having agency?
Well, agency is how you sort of claim rights within the structures that exist. And the structure is the multicultural state structure that defines multiculturalism as religion.
Yes, but that's precisely what interests me, that I think you also noticed it, that there is a kind of distortion in that translation process, right? That's precisely what's interesting, right? But also, if we are talking about like some kind of emancipatory kind of potential or whatever, then I think colonized people should also develop a way to articulate ideas which are true to their experiences, and not just be surrogate mimic men, right? Because even mimic men have agency. Nobody says they don't, right?
Go for it.
So I also have tons of things to say, and I'll save some for later today, but my thoughts kind of, I was going to say something before you, John over here spoke,
Yeah.
and I want to just sort of connect what I was thinking, what you were saying. I think part of the colonial consciousness framework that I'm hearing here doesn't have to be, it's almost, it's embraced and run after. It's not necessarily passively just, it's, and exactly the points you were making is all these good things about Christianity, all these good things about us, we had them too, is exactly the colonial consciousness operating, because they're saying it's good and therefore we have it. But where they get the idea it's good, the point is that they've already internalized the colonial consciousness that all this stuff is good. And so to say that we have it too is exactly the thing happening. So therefore, I definitely like the macro kind of argument, and that I've seen it happen in many ways, but I'm a little confused by your examples. So I would have used completely different examples to make that point. So on the forced marriage thing, it seemed to me like you were doing a little bit of apples and oranges in your observation. In your observation, you said you have to kind of look hard at Islamic law to find consent. I don't think I have to look that hard, but it's not as front and center as human rights discourses make it, sure. And then you said, but if you look at the practices, it's obvious that it's not about consent, it's about family relationships. But when you mentioned the Western European, the English context, I didn't hear you talking about the practices and the elite alliances of rich families and women not really having all that much consent really in who they were arranged to marry, even if it was in the sort of name of consent. But so anyway, so if you're going to look at the law, then look at the law on both sides. If you're going to look at the practices, then look at the practices on both sides. And I think in both cases, there wasn't all that much agency in practice, depending on which society, which time period, which social class, all of that. Okay. So I'm a little confused by using that as the example of this absorption of thinking about forced marriage as a bad thing, that it's a completely Western thing, because I think there's enough, I could make the case that there's enough in the law in Islam for that, and there's enough in the law in the West for that, and there's enough not in the practices in Muslim cultures, and there's not enough in the practices of the West that would prove that. But I would say that there's other things, exactly in your quote right here, I think the absorption of a colonial consciousness, I see it in the line that says, this is primarily, I'm down at sort of toward the 2/3 down, this is primarily due to the lack of institutionalization of the Islamic faith. Institutionalization of faith is a European church Christian kind of concept. It's not a Muslim historical concept. But he's saying, well, the problem is because we haven't institutionalized our religion enough. We haven't created these, bodies that, kind of control it and centralize it and uniformly apply it. That's, I think, an example of the colonial consciousness. I could give many other examples. Keisha Ali has written about the colonial consciousness absorption of the idea of the roles of housewife and breadwinner husband as the modern description in Muslim communities of what a marriage is, which historically in the literature, that is not the categorization of how the roles of the husband and wife were, but yet it's used now as a justification for a whole bunch of other things that are attached to Muslim marriages. So anyway, I kind of like the macro point, and I've seen it in my own life, but your example really confused me, and I think I had an allergic reaction.
That's a very, very good point. Don't get reaction, but it's a good point, and probably calls to attention the fact that I wasn't 100% clear in making a distinction between theological justification, right? Which is theological justification, which requires basically it's a variation on doctrinal justifications, right? So that you need to be able to give explanations by reference to doctrine for practices, right? That's what theological accounts do. And of course, they are well established in Western thinking, right? In the Muslim world, actually, I don't find, because of maybe just as the Western world has gone through this process of secularization, which I say is a popularization of Christian theological concepts, right? Very widely through the population. I'm not really sure that the Islamic world has gone through a similar type of process, right? It is going through such processes now, right? Which is why you can claim maybe that the idea of consent to you becomes like a second nature thing. Of course, marriage involves consent. When I talk about similar type of issues to South Asian Muslims who live in Britain, they don't think in those terms. They don't talk in those terms. But then the additional problem comes in. How do you justify ancestral practice, right? Because the call for justification for any particular practice has to be theological, right? It might be theological in the secularized form that we do it in the West today, right? Or it might be explicitly religious, right? So it's religious cultures like Islam and Christianity which require some kind of justification as a foundation for practice, right? This is what our minister does as well, I think, right? Right? This is now, you talk about the multicultural state. The multicultural state, marked by Christian toleration, actually looks to not only justification for practices, but if there is an absence of justification, it means that those practices can be reformed because they are indicative of the fact that there isn't a true religious basis for them. This is exactly how the British colonial state acted, right, during the colonial period, right? So you will always have a problem in trying to find a justification for a particular practice if it's not going to be a theological justification. It's a massive intercultural problem that we have in the world today, right? And so that's why you get, all kinds of Buddhists and so on, right? Saying, well, we do this because we have these things as well, right? They are, of course, invented and through an exercise of agency. I agree with that, right? But they're an attempt to provide foundations for practices that were never actually required to have foundations, right? In those doctrinal terms.
I'm just going to take the liberty, because I wasn't really meant to be the moderator, to throw in. I want to just queer your argument a little, and then I'll let the legal eagles loose on you again. I guess because of what's happening in America, and I'm sure you're aware of it, with the Defense of Marriage Act. I have an allergic reaction to the whole concept of marriage at the moment, because I feel that we're all being held hostage, and I'm just wondering about agency and consent. And I don't like the statement that South Asian Muslim practices are not based on consent. I think that's a problematic statement. But really, I guess at the moment where I am, because of what's happening here in the States, is this. It's the way that we're all kind of in this colonial consciousness. So what's happening is that gay marriage is kind of held up as the final frontier of equality. And a statement like you have there, common culture, values based on equality and respect between men and women, that just makes me come out in hives. Who are these people who have the nerve to put that up on the internet? Because I don't think that may sound good, but that's not
that's
really
a British minister.
What's that?
That's a British minister.
I know. Well,
they're quite tough-minded people.
So there's something about ideas of what we should want and what we should aspire to that makes us feel like we have agency, that we're being equal in the eyes of the law, and that is, of course, you can see that's very important, but it's also somehow feels very lip servicey in other ways. And so I'm thinking about cousin marriage, for instance. If that is, is that something you consider a forced marriage? And most people, if you had to marry your cousin, you'd have to have a gun against your head in order to agree to that. But if that's something you're brought up with, is something that happens, there may be all sorts of familial and possibly immigration benefits to that custom. At what point does it become forced? At what point is that not something that you're kind of grown up, the same way that you go to church at Christmas or whatever? That's something that most kids don't want to do, but they do it. And they probably wouldn't then later on say that we're forced into that. It was like, but we're all being told at the moment that marriage is the end all and be all. That's what gives us a certain status in the world, and we should want it. And I feel that nobody at the moment, the debate is going here in the United States, nobody's any agency in that at all. I think we're all being brainwashed by some kind of machine. So I just wanted to give you that little perspective. And then as I said, I know that the legals among us have other issues as well. But.
No, thank you. We don't have much time, so I just wanted to express my sort of puzzlement that you talk about the animus against arranged marriages without talking about feminism and or maybe that's a bad way to put it, the women's movement and movements for gender equality throughout the world, as an independent force, not something I think that you could subsume under colonial consciousness. And that's a big topic, but I wonder if you could tell us who has used the Forced Marriage Act. Has it been used, and who are the people who who want to use it on their behalf?
Mainly I think it's social workers, but also police.
On behalf of?
But also legal counsel who act on behalf of young women and men.
But
Yeah.
are there really? Isn't it really a woman's issue?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Even men get forced into marriages.
Mhm.
So but are you trying to make a larger point about?
Well, as I say,
Is it connected to your comment about feminism and the women's movement for women's equality?
That there's something in the room that's not just a sort of aspect of colonialism or devaluation of Islam, but this the somewhat independent feature of women's rights that it seemed to me just is a powerful, I assume in the UK as here, a sort of powerful independent force that's shaping these events. And that a lot of the ferment that we see within communities is not a response necessarily to developments within that community, but to this kind of external or more pervasive kind of force or movement that's around us.
Well, Mark, some conservative Muslim men do say that the women's movement within Muslim communities is an external corruption from the West,
Mhm.
and it is a colonial imposition, and they resist it that way. I mean, I don't know if that would be cleverly made, but that is one of the arguments internally to the Muslim women's movement as a discrediting of it.
And colonial history, women's rights and colonial history, I mean,
Yeah,
those are not two
they're
independent, they're very
connected.
much intertwined
Yeah.
story about justifying British rule in India to save Indian
To save women,
So,
Mhm.
Yeah, or bombing Afghanistan, for instance.
Yeah.
Right, yes, absolutely, yes, yeah.
So okay, I mean, no, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if would it have been possible to talk in terms of women's equality were it not for the Protestant Reformation? So it seems to me that the roots, at least the roots of maybe not the generalizations, but generalization, like through or the diffusion of the women's movement, but certainly the roots of the women's movement and their kind of initial articulations are a product of Christian anthropology, I think. And in a way, that's why they don't always have a good reception in other parts of the world, or actually become unintelligible when you move into contexts like India and so on. You know, in India you've got very interesting things at the moment. You know, all the reforms in particularly in Indian family law are being driven by a very vocal lobby of feminist advocates, but with very scant attention to what's actually happening in the socio-legal sphere. You know, so it's almost like if you like a kind of auto-generated colonial consciousness which is operating within the Indian state. You know. And of course, one of their targets is paganism within Hindu law and so on. So that's the kind of target there. They wouldn't think about it like that, but that's the underlying dynamic.
But
So the framework still holds. That's actually one of the reasons why I originally wanted to talk about India, but then cut back. You know, kind of drew back because of the time factor. But the Indian example, the reforms to various segments of Indian family law are precisely the enactment of the kind of dynamic that I'm describing for the diasporic Muslim groups here. That's exactly what's happened particularly in the post-independence period, but also the colonial period.
I am going to give Mitra a chance to ask a question. I also want to say next time Japan gets mentioned, we could have hit them up. Yeah, so East Asian studies have lots of money, so people, budget cuts. You hear Japan, you say, come on, yes, India not so important. And after Mitra's question, I want to ramp up the formal part of this lecture. I know many of you will be spending time with Professor Shah later on, so Mitra.
so just to kind of wrap-up comment. So this is a story about how the customary has been kicked upon by everyone, right? Everyone dumps on the customary. The religious gets elevated and sort of protected, and the customary is the disreputable kind of leftovers that take the blame for everything. And you suggested that this is a feature of the kind of multicultural, the state of the identity of the multicultural state in Britain is to kind of, as I understood you, to elevate and protect religion above culture, let's say, or custom. But I've also been thinking about the longer history of the English-speaking legal world. And what I see there is a distinct preference for the religious over the customary, and it has to do with writing, because the religious is written down, and the customary is not. And so let's say the British colonial state in India, quite happy to go along and pick up, okay, let's find a Hindu text, let's some Islamic ones, let's translate, compile, publish, and then we can get rid of our Indian legal experts, and the judge can just have his textbook, and everyone's, well, we're happy, the British are happy, right? But the customary, what is that? Well, it depends, it's regionally incredibly diverse, and you talk to different people, different accounts, changes over time, so just very, very uncomfortable with the customary, because it's oral. And so I wonder if that's also part of this story, that the religious has always been easier to protect because it's easier to identify, easier than the customary.
Well, Hindu law was the outlier in that it was so friendly to custom and so willing to incorporate custom, whereas common law was very hostile to custom. I mean, it had a series of tests to see whether something custom was valid law, and it was a long and deadly list that made it almost impossible to prove a custom in variance to the common law, a common law. And as I say, Hindu law is sort of at the other end, but Muslim law, I don't know, you're suggesting is more like the English than the Hindu in terms of its hostility to custom, or it's not hostility, at least its tendency to subordinate custom to the general law.
I'm not really speaking about Islamic law. I'm speaking about what Anglospheric legal systems do when they encounter religion with a textual, written, scriptural basis, versus when they encounter customary norms that are just how people act, not written down. And they're very uncomfortable with the latter, I would say. So,
Do you want to respond, Prakash?
oh, and just one last. In England, if you were really serious about upholding custom, what you would do is you'd use the jury, special jury of experts. But in the colonial context, that's just giving too much power to the colonized. So the British start the jury in India, and they're very uncomfortable and start to sort of withdraw it.
I mean, if we use colonial practice as a reference point, then, this dynamic that I mentioned earlier about, this one, about the colonial state actively looking for justifications in doctrine. And so Hindu texts were marshaled as to provide foundations for practices. Muslim texts, legal texts, were marshaled to provide foundations for Muslim practices and so on. So there was a particular dynamic generated, right, which of course read custom in a way which was completely different to what was going on in the pre-colonial period, right, where there was a very fluid attention, if you like, fluidity and more attention, if you like, devoted to the customary sphere. So the colonial state and the British multicultural state today, which is basically an upgraded version of liberal toleration, right? That's how I see multiculturalism. It still hasn't really removed, it's not unencumbered, if you like, from its religious roots. I think still function like that, and this quote tells us that that's what's happening, because they are looking for foundations for practices. That's a kind of roundabout way of answering your question, I'm afraid.
I feel that we've done to Prakash what we in England think American academic audiences do. Mean, nasty people. So thank
But
you.
I deserve it because I always say things that, wind people up.
Well, maybe this is what we believe about lawyers.
That's
I don't
all
know,
right.
but thank you so much for putting up
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are you willing to forgive me for never returning your phone?